Shortly after he had moved to the village of Concord, Massachusetts, Ralph Waldo Emerson was introduced by a mutual friend to a fellow Harvard University alumni, Henry David Thoreau. And the younger man struck Emerson as an individual of unusual abilities. "My friend," Emerson recorded in his own journal, "has as free and erect a mind as any I have ever met." Now, from a temperamental standpoint, these men could not have been more different. But, despite that, they hit it off. And at Emerson's urging, Thoreau began keeping his own journal, and in a quarter of a century, he did fill 39 volumes with his musings. Although more than a few of his acquaintances found Henry to be insufferable, Emerson admired some of the very qualities that put others off. His speech was laconic, biting, laced with ironic humor, as Carlos Baker says, and Emerson found that kind of speech to be utterly refreshing. Thoreau was not one to waste or to mince his words. When he spoke, his speech was often blunt, and it was often right to the point. And Emerson found his pithy epigrams to be especially appealing. Thoreau wrote, "The bluebird carries the sky on his back," and "nothing is to be so much feared as fear," an expression that Franklin D. Roosevelt is indebted to. Now, physically, Thoreau and Emerson were rather of an odd couple. "A quaint stump figure of a man" is how William Dean Howells described Thoreau, while Emerson was noted for his long and lanky 6-foot frame. But both men's noses dominated their features, and both were pale-skinned and blue-eyed. Thoreau's glance could be intimidating, Emerson noted, for his terrible eyes often blazed with an icy bluish light. Whether it was his chilly personality, his physical appearance, or a combination of both, Thoreau never found a life partner. Twice as a younger man, he proposed marriage. Twice he was met with rejection. For someone with Thoreau's hypersensitive character, Edward Abbey writes, these must have been disabling blows to what little confidence he possessed. And yet, Thoreau did not lack for companionship. Although he once declared nature to be far more interesting than people, he did enjoy a close relationship with members of his own immediate family as well as with the Emerson household. A sometimes house guest, Thoreau served as a handyman, a gardener, a secretary, a child care provider for the Emersons, winning the enduring affection of their children. On one occasion, Thoreau responded to young Lydian Emerson's concerns about her chickens. Lydian was upset because the hens had to be confined to their coop during the coldest months of the year, lest their little feet freeze. Well, as a master of invention, Henry made for each hen a fitted pair of cowhide shoes that could be secured around their slender ankles. And thus, throughout the winter, they could promenade freely in the frozen backyard. Now, given our subject's reputation as a hermit, which is owed largely to his descriptions that are found in Walden, the foregoing accounts may seem to be somewhat out of character. And it is true, in this classic piece of American literature, Thoreau does present us with a very different kind of self-portrait. He's not making little booties for hens. Now, he built his small cabin on Walden in a property that actually was owned by Emerson, and he built that cabin at a total cost of $28.12, a detail that he recorded faithfully in one of his journals. And here, as he famously put it, he set out to live deliberately, fronting only the essential facts of life. Simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. That was to be his watchword. And as Thoreau tells it, he took pains to apply that very principle to both his material and his relational life. No superfluous curtains would adorn this new domicile. Nor, he said, do I require a doormat, of which he wrote disparagingly, I had no room to spare within the house for a doormat, no time to shake it out outside. I prepare to wipe my feet on the sod before the door. It is best to avoid the beginnings of evil. He could be equally dismissive of friendship. I love my friends very much, he conceded, but I find it is of no use to go to see them. Even when I meet them unexpectedly, I part from them with sorrow. And reacting to this aloofness, Ellery Channing, a frequent hiking companion, wrote, "Behold Henry David Thoreau, he who believes in simplicity, he who has gone steadily along the rough places and the thorns in order to crucify and kill out all the human virtues. Each social faculty in which other people delight, he mortifies. And what is his compensation for all of this? Eternal solitude and endless blundering." That from a friend. So this year does mark the 200th anniversary of Thoreau's birth, an appropriate occasion to inquire into the source of this strange man's enduring appeal. During his lifetime, he was surrounded by the social and literary leaders of the American Romantic or the Transcendentalist movement, including such notables as Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Bronson Alcott, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Margaret Fuller. And although Emerson recognized Thoreau's genius, Margaret Fuller scorned Henry David Thoreau. And as editor of The Dial, a Transcendentalist periodical, she rejected most of the material that he submitted. And yet Henry David Thoreau is the one among all those notables that I just mentioned who has survived and even conquered the test of time. Edward Abbey did not bring along Emerson's essays for inspiration as he floated down the Green River. He chose Walden, which in the estimation of the historian Perry Miller certifies Thoreau as the supreme artist to come out of the Transcendentalist ferment. As a writer, Miller says he stands head and shoulders above the pale wraith of Ralph Waldo Emerson. So how do we account for the enduring source of this man's appeal? There are three facets to Thoreau's thought that are worth mentioning here: our relationship with the natural world, the lifestyles that we may choose to adopt for ourselves, and the social and ethical responsibilities that we might have as individuals. He speaks to all three of these in a timeless manner. So with respect to nature, Thoreau's outlook can only be described as deeply religious. Nestling near to nature's bosom, we sense a divine presence. We are privy to transcendental truths. And here, in speaking about his relationship with nature, Thoreau comes closest to the Emersonian ideal of the natural spirit-infused man. The good river god has taken the form of my valiant Henry Thoreau, Emerson enthused. And Thoreau's own meditations on nature read like a 19th century biblical psalm. He says, "Of thee, O earth, are my bone and sinew made. To thee, O sun, I am brother. To this dust my body will gladly return as to its origin. Here I have my habitat. I am of thee." Thoreau qualifies as a nature mystic, for as Paul Bowler observes, his sense of kinship was so profound that on occasion he felt totally absorbed into the natural processes environing him. And in this very respect, Thoreau has been a source of considerable inspiration for spiritually oriented nature writers of the 20th century, like Loren Eiseley and Annie Dillard and Sigurd Olson. Thoreau was impatient with the abstractions, the armchair philosophizing of his fellow transcendentalists. Thoreau was eager to acquaint himself with nature firsthand, which is something that Emerson really made much of an attempt to do. Nature is not a place to visit, it is home. That's what the 20th century poet Gary Snyder wrote, and Thoreau would have wholeheartedly agreed with that sentiment. Nor was this a passing fancy for Thoreau. Both before and after his 2-year sojourn at Walden Pond, he continued to spend what might seem to us to be an inordinate amount of time trekking through the woods and the fields of eastern Massachusetts. And people would typically see him out walking, and he would be wearing a straw hat, he would have sturdy shoes, and he would have trousers that were substantial enough to ward off the thick underbrush that he wandered through, or to allow him to climb through the rough bark of a tree where he could see what was in a squirrel nest or a hawk's nest above. And his outsized passion for the natural world sometimes frustrated Ralph Waldo Emerson, for to him it signaled a lack of ambition and a waste of potential. It is an inexcusable fault, Emerson wrote, that Henry would rather be the captain of a huckleberry party than the head of the American Engineers. Brushing off such criticism, Thoreau expressed his own displeasure with the Puritan work ethic. The order of things, he said, should be reversed. The seventh shall be man's day of toil, wherein to earn his living by the sweat of his brow. The other six, those days are to be his Sabbath, in which to range this widespread garden and drink in the soft influences and the sublime revelations of nature. Now, Thoreau's relationship with nature also had its practical side. He extolled its therapeutic value, writing, "If you are filled with melancholy, go to the swamp and see the brave spears of the skunk cabbage buds already advancing into the new year. Do not despair of life. You have no doubt force enough to overcome any of your obstacles." In much the same vein, traditional Japanese healers prescribe something called forest bathing, Shinrin Yoku, to treat stress and insomnia and anxiety. Thoreau was ahead of his time. And lastly, there is Thoreau, the scientific naturalist. He claimed to be able to tell the time of year within 2 days by simply observing the plants alone. His journals, from which much of the material in Walden was drawn, contains detailed descriptions of the plants and the animals that he encountered, the landscapes he traversed. His powers of observation, Perry Miller observes, seemed to indicate additional senses beyond the 5 that we all possess. So Thoreau's sensitivity toward his deep knowledge of the natural world, that also aroused his protective instincts. He became a sharp critic of unrestrained free enterprise, and he anticipated by 100 years Aldo Leopold's land ethic. A man would be judged a loafer if, for love of the woods, he walked in them for half of each day, Thoreau wrote. But if that same man spends his whole day as a speculator, shearing off the woods, making the earth bald before its time, then he is esteemed an industrious and enterprising citizen. Thank God they cannot cut down the clouds. All kinds of figures are drawn on that blue ground with those fibrous paints. So a second facet of Thoreau's life and literary input is summed up in one of his best-known epigrams. A man, he said, is rich in proportion to the number of things that he can afford to let alone. Thoreau was an outspoken advocate of voluntary simplicity, and his retreat to that sparsely furnished cabin on the banks of Walden Pond was meant as a test of his very principles. Simplify, 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 he said, and that has become the mantra for generations of his admirers. And although he would not emulate that type of behavior, that particular epigram, Ralph Waldo Emerson did applaud his friend's efforts in this regard. How near to the old monks in their ascetic religion, he commented. Henry, he said, has no talent for wealth, but he knows how to be poor without the least hint of squalor or inelegance. There is, however, more than a whiff of hypocrisy in the claims that Thoreau made for himself. Writing in the New Yorker, Catherine Schultz took issue both with Thoreau's rigid asceticism and with, as she puts it, his failure always to walk his talk. On the one hand, Thoreau once described salt as an unnecessary luxury. Why salt your food? He advised eating only a single meal a day. And on one occasion, he claimed that a 6 by 3 foot tool chest would make a fine home, provided it was equipped with a few air holes. He abstains from almost everything that his neighbors innocently and pleasurably use, Robert Louis Stevenson observed after he had read Walden. But his abstemious claims aside, it was really Thoreau's inconsistency that troubled Catherine Schultz the most. Because in Walden, he does gloss over the fact that in 20 minutes he could walk right into the friendly village of Concord, where he procured food from his own family's larder and where he was often invited to share in the Emerson's table. Thoreau lived a complicated life, Schultz writes, but he pretended to live a simple one. Does it matter in the end that Thoreau failed to measure up to the ideals that he professed? Well, to the extent that he faulted others for their simple indulgences, it does matter. For he is asking more of all of us than he is asking of himself. Nevertheless, at a time when the average person in the world's 34 richest nations consumes about 220 pounds of stuff every day, most of it simply a function of our own modern lifestyles, then a little more emphasis on simplicity wouldn't hurt any of us. So finally, let's consider Thoreau's social and political positions. As a thinker, Thoreau elevates individual rights and individual prerogatives over collective responsibilities, and he is often cited approvingly by libertarians and the advocates of limited government. Human institutions were a frequent target of Thoreau's disdain. Businesses, he said, were rapacious, and the churches were filled with hypocrites and moral cowards. The voice that goes up from our houses of worship, he wrote, is not so brace or cheering as that which rises from the frog ponds of the land. Thoreau's harshest criticisms, however, were reserved for the public sector, for, as he famously said, that government is best which governs not at all. And despite the able assistance that he rendered to the members of the Emerson family, Thoreau also denied that as an individual, he had no social obligations beyond himself. I come into this world, he said, not chiefly to make this a good place to live, but just to live in it, be it good or bad. And despite his professed scorn for those who choose labor over a leisurely walk in the woods, as I said earlier, 6 days of the week, that should be your Sabbath. You work on the seventh. Despite that, he also evinced very little sympathy for non-producers, as he called them. They are, he wrote, bloodsuckers fastening themselves to every helpful man or woman in the world. Ayn Rand couldn't have said it better. Thoreau was no fan of democracy, and he mistrusted the popular will because he said the people, they express strength but not morality. But he expressed great confidence in himself and in his own conscience, which he said was the sole arbiter, his own conscience, the sole arbiter of right and wrong, true and false. Because Thoreau fancied himself a man who was in touch with higher truths, the truths about which the masses of humanity, ruled by their passions, know next to nothing. With respect to the wisdom of his elders, well, dismissively he wrote that off, saying, I have yet to hear the first syllable of advice from my seniors. And that being said, and despite his inconsistencies, Thoreau often did respond to the promptings of his own conscience, the seat of all moral and ethical authority, responded to his conscience, the promptings of his conscience, in very meaningful ways. He protested the federal government's imperialistic policies with Mexico by refusing to pay his taxes, a stand that landed him in jail until an unknown party came forward and settled his account. An ardent abolitionist, Thoreau defended John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, and he wrote that in a slave state, prison is the only place a free man can abide with any degree of honor. Reformers from Gandhi to the Berrigan brothers to Martin Luther King have all gained inspiration from Thoreau's germinal essay, Resistance to Civil Government. It's also important to put Thoreau's denunciations of government and of American society more generally in their proper context. Because much of what he was writing in the 1840s and the early 50s was in reaction to the presidencies of Andrew Jackson and his successors, presidencies which he described as vulgar and mediocre. It was a decline in America's public standards, Paul Bowler writes, that made Thoreau into a militant nonconformist and caused him to express a preference for solitude over society and nature over humanity. So 2 centuries after Thoreau's birth, a great admirer of President Jackson, now sits in the Oval Office, which might make it easier to understand how Thoreau felt at the time. Now, Henry Thoreau struggled with tuberculosis in his final years, and he succumbed to that disease in 1862, just shy of his 45th birthday. And whatever they made of him in his life, his friends were inspired by Thoreau's dying. He refused medications to ease his pain, saying, "I want to die with a clear mind." Nor did he ever lose his wry sense of humor. One world at a time, he said, brushing aside questions about the afterlife. And when his Aunt Louise asked if he had made his peace with God, Thoreau smiled and said, "I did not know we'd ever quarreled." Sam Staples was the jailer who locked Thoreau up for a night many years earlier. And Sam Staples, who was also a hunting companion of Thoreau's, he was the last person to see Thoreau alive. "Never spent an hour with more satisfaction," he later wrote to Emerson. "Never saw a man dying with so much peace and pleasure." Blessed be and amen. So we will